Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Thursday, 7th September. It will be cloudy all day with highs of 19 degrees Celsius or 66 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:13 a.m. and sunset at 7:27 p.m. We are on the 38th day of the Warsaw Uprising and the Red Cross steps in. What does the Red Cross have to do with the uprising, Alina?
Before we get to the Red Cross, I think Claire's going to kick us off today, really. Claire, the podcast is yours.
This is key day in the Warsaw Uprising. It's the day the Germans first proposed capitulation to the Poles. And the Poles, it's very hard for the Poles to see an alternative at this point. The old town has been destroyed. They've had to evacuate. They're pulling back to a smaller and smaller part of the city. Both the citizens and the soldiers are demoralised and they're starving, really, at this point as well. There is death everywhere. Everyone has lost someone. Most people have lost many people. John Ward, writing in the Times, we've quoted him quite a lot, but he just says here, on every conceivable little piece of ground are graves of civilians and soldiers. It's hardly impossible to walk across the city, to run, to fight without fighting over the bodies of the dead. Another Home Army soldier talks about how hungry they were. He said, "We ate horse, then we ate all the cats and the dogs and the pigeons, of course, and then there was nothing left." So it's really a truly desperate situation, but it's not going to be lack of food. It's really the lack of arms that drives Bo Komorowski to the negotiating table. And there's lots of factors in play here. One of the things I think is quite interesting is the involvement of the Red Cross in the capitulation talks. Alina, can you talk to us a bit about what role they have played? We haven't really talked about them before, but what they played in the uprising and what they're doing now.
Yes, the Red Cross, not an organisation you think would be participating in the Warsaw Uprising, yet they did. So in the first initial 10 days of the uprising, there were several Polish Red Cross hospitals that were opened, including one of the hospitals you were talking about yesterday, Claire, actually. The one that was bombed and then the fire spread to the neighbouring building. So that one was a Polish Red Cross hospital. So there were about, in total, 28 medical points throughout the whole of the city of Warsaw. And even though there were Red Cross symbols that were visible from planes that were flying above, they were still the targets of air attacks. So the Germans didn't care if this was a Red Cross organisation or if it was just a general hospital. It didn't matter. They still bombed them. So many people, many volunteers, many doctors, many nurses who worked for the Red Cross ended up losing their lives, specifically in bombings and also in a lot of mass murders that were happening around the city. So they were also involved in shootings and grenade explosions and artillery bombings and everything. So, but the Red Cross was actually, the help was directed at civilians and wounded Home Army soldiers. But you've also got to remember, because this is the Red Cross, Germans and Russians or Soviets were also under the medical care of this movement. It's a neutral organisation. And quote, they say, "We help all those who suffer and do not fight, civilians, the wounded, prisoners of war, families of the dead and missing." So they also operated as an auxiliary service, so soldiers who left hospitals were fed before they returned to their units, and also units arriving from the Campinos forest were given the following amount of items. So they were given 2,000 pieces of underwear, 500 pairs of socks and various different foot wraps, 100 sheets and towels, over 100 coats and jackets, several dozen pairs of shoes, and a dozen or so kilograms of soap and various other undergarments. So the Red Cross also organised orphanages and shelters, and they helped provide all of them with food and medical assistance. This was an incredible organisation that functioned in such a terrible time where there was a lack of food, a lack of water, a lack of medical equipment, and a lack of people to be able to help the wounded and the sick. They also organised in various districts in Warsaw what they were called were information officers. So small branches that provided information about the dead and wounded, and they meticulously collected from every possible place information on these people, and every burial, if possible, was recorded. There were so many special files, and they were later used during the search for the missing. And what's very interesting is, we will come to my great-grandmother in a couple of weeks, but she is on the Polish Red Cross list of exhumations and information. So yes, that's how I found information of exactly where she was killed and where she was buried. So, but they would also transport wounded. So here's a good example. The nurses were trying to transport a wounded insurgent on a stretcher from the corner of Nowogródzka and Krucza Street to Jaworzyńska. Now, some of you, it's just a name. They're just names. Now I'm going to give you more specifics to this. So it took them 15 hours to move 1.4 kilometres, which is just under a mile, so that's 0.8 miles. Now, if we're to do that today, or let's say in a time where there were no restrictions, you're looking at between 15 to 20 minutes. That depends on how fast you walk. And at that time, it took them 15 hours to move an insurgent to a hospital. I mean, in that 15 hours, that insurgent could have died. They could have been hit by another artillery bomb. They could have been hit by another air raid. Anything could be possible, or even German snipers that were hiding in various different buildings. So yes, the Red Cross was a very, very, very important organisation, and they did a lot, and many people who volunteered for them did lose their lives. Now, why are we talking about the Red Cross specifically today? Well, it is today that the representatives of the Polish Red Cross were authorised by the authorities of the uprising to hold negotiations with the German command to evacuate the old, sick and children from the city. So the evacuation of the civilian population was scheduled for the 8th and the 9th of September between 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. So they were to allow civilians to leave the city of their own free will rather than be deported to Pruszków and then sent on to God knows where. And as we know, either they could have ended up in concentration camps, many in Auschwitz, 13,000 ended up in Auschwitz alone, or all forced labour. So we talked about the Holy Cross Church yesterday, or I talked about the Holy Cross Church yesterday, but there is something that we haven't discussed that happens more or less today, and what happens inside the church, even though it's been completely demolished. I'm going to let Roger tell you a little bit more about the story.
Yeah, so one of the most treasured possessions that was kept in the Holy Cross Church was Chopin's heart. Now, after Chopin had died in 1849, his heart was removed and was pickled in alcohol and kept in an oak box, and it was sort of mounted in the Holy Cross Church as a sort of a relic, very much as a relic actually. And when the church itself was so badly damaged and destroyed, really, then that obviously had to be removed. And there's a number of sort of conflicting theories about what happened to it in the interim. I suppose the most probable is that it was actually taken or given to von der Bach himself, who had a collection of curios, evidently, think curiosities. And as I've said before, the members of the SS often could be remarkably sort of cultured on one level. And it's the sort of thing, to have Chopin's heart on his desk, as it were, is something you can imagine that von der Bach might have been quite keen to have. They evidently had also some sort of handover procedure which was supposed to be filmed for German propaganda, where von der Bach then sort of ceremonially handed over to the Bishop of Warsaw, Antoni Szlagowski. This evidently, if that's how it panned out, this would have been a very good sort of propaganda coup for von der Bach to not only show how cultured and humane the Germans are, or how they like to present themselves, but also to sort of burnish his own credentials as a sort of a cultured and enlightened military leader. So you can see how this would be meat and drink for German propaganda. There is, of course, another suggestion, which that it disappeared into the hands of the Polish underground and then was given to the Bishop Szlagowski. And this, if that were the case, that would echo the fate of the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, which is one of the, absolutely one of the most prized and holy relics of all of Poland, and that disappeared from memory pretty swiftly in 1939 and disappeared into the Polish underground for safekeeping. And I think in the case of the Black Madonna, they even produced a fake version of it, which the Germans then took control of. Does that ring a bell with you, Alina?
Yeah, I think it was like on the 3rd of September or something along those lines where they switched it. They hid it behind the cloister and they replaced the original, like you said, with a copy. And this copy was actually painted before the war by one of the other monks. So yeah, no, you're right.
At least some of these things survive. I think it wasn't Thomas Hardy's heart. I think that was taken to be buried elsewhere and was in the meantime eaten by his cat.
Oh my God. Anyway, nothing so mundane happened to Chopin's heart, happily. It did go back to Bishop of Warsaw, as I've described, and ended up being restored to its place in the rebuilt Holy Cross Church after the war. Claire, we've talked a few times about how ordinary life sort of continued amongst the ruins and the fighting of the Warsaw Rising, and there's a rather significant wedding on this day. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, while we're doing churches, let's talk about a wedding. This is the wedding of Jan Novak, who I've mentioned a few times. He is the guy, a member of the Chico Chimney, the Silent Unseen, who's been sent in with rum. But Novak is running the Lightning radio station. And he had fallen in love earlier on, before the Warsaw Uprising, actually. He'd fallen in love with a Home Army liaison officer, Jadwiga Wolska. Her codename was Greta, so she's known as Greta. She was called Greta because of her film style looks and her garbo hairdo, apparently. And he was totally struck by her right from the start. He said, with a snub nose and large, beautiful, slightly slanted eyes, she was stunning. So, so he was madly in love. And at this point in the uprising, their emotions just must have been absolutely everywhere, because Greta's sister had been serving as well alongside her. In fact, Greta's sister Gyula had actually taken German prisoners of war earlier on in the uprising, just by pretending to have a hand grenades, I believe. So she was incredibly, strong woman who had managed to get these prisoners just on bluff, essentially. But Gyula had been killed just 2 days earlier during the fighting. And obviously Novak and Greta are absolutely heartbroken by this. But at this point, it feels, they know there are talks ongoing. They know that the city may fall. They've lost one of the most close people to them. But at this point, Novak says, let's get married. Let's, while we're still both alive, let's seal our love. Let's make it official. And so he proposes to her. He says, let's get married now while there are still some churches and some priests left in this city. She agreed. He went off to find a priest to officiate. She wasn't idle while he was gone. She managed to trade a precious tin of meat, one of the last that she had been saving, for a pair of copper wedding rings. I don't think they were actual wedding rings, but, rings that they could use. And then they got married. And Novak, who, spoiler, he did survive the Warsaw Uprising, he later he wrote about their wedding. It's just this wonderful picture. So I'm just going to quote him directly. He said, the news of the wedding of a parachutist, which is himself because he was a member of the Silent Unseen, and a Home Army liaison girl travelled fast, and the chapel was full. With the Germans just 300 yards away, we crunched up to the altar on broken glass. Not one stained glass window in the chapel was still unbroken. Our young priest was in a hurry. He had a funeral service scheduled next. The wedding ceremony was over in 7 minutes. Then 2 young soldiers offered Greta a bunch of gladioli, which they had picked in the garden of the school for deaf mutes and the blind. And our RAF friend, John Ward, was also there with a wedding gift, a beautiful picture of the Black Madonna. So that's the Madonna of Czestochowa that Roger was talking about. Straight after the ceremony, Jan and Greta went to Greta's sister's grave, and Greta placed her gladioli, her wedding flowers, on the grave. I think that was the closest they could get to sharing that moment with her. But then when they got back to their quarters, they found that there was a surprise party for them. And one of Jan's colleagues had a young wife whose parents had previously owned one of Warsaw's most famous delicatessens. And somehow this guy miraculously produced a bottle of wine, a tin of meat, and 2 tins of sardines. Later, Jan would say that was the last meat he had in the uprising, except for a pigeon that had been killed by the blast of a bomb. So even in these most desperate circumstances, everyone's emotions are heightened, and everyone knows that, or they believe they're nearly at the end of the Warsaw Uprising. They are managing to steal a few moments for themselves and to celebrate love. So Novak said that news of his wedding had travelled fast, but it only travelled within Warsaw at this point. And later they would both be interviewed on the BBC, in fact, after the war, where he was trying to provide testimony of the Warsaw Uprising and people were more interested in this romantic wedding. So it became a little bit of a burden for him. But what is the international press most interested in at the moment?
Yeah, there's an interesting and rather chilling cartoon in the Evening Standard on the 7th of September relating to Warsaw. And it's by David Lowe, who's a famous cartoonist. He was a New Zealander by birth, who'd probably the most famous of the wartime British cartoonists. And you'll remember that David Lowe had drawn the cartoon which had Hitler and Stalin in a sort of three-legged race, across the frontier of Poland in 1939. There was another one that had Hitler and Stalin greeting each other over the corpse of Poland, and it's, in a sense, commemorating or noting this unlikely alliance between Moscow and Berlin. And David Lowe had also done the famous cartoon in 1940 where Churchill sort of stands alone, representing Britain standing alone. And the caption to that was, "Very well, alone." He really had a sort of a sense of capturing the salient moment in his cartoons, and that's what made him so successful. But this cartoon that he drew, which was published on the 7th of September, is altogether rather darker. And it shows a group of insurgents fighting at a sort of broken down section of wall, and beyond them there's the ruins of Warsaw, and it says on the ground is written "Tragic Warsaw." And just behind them is the figure of General Sosnkowski as one of the senior members of the Polish military, but in London. And on his uniform are the words "political ineptness." So this is kind of showing criticism of the Poles, and the whole thing is captioned actually underneath "unhelpful friend." So this is showing that the Poles, this is that sort of argument that we've been talking about all the way along, is that increasingly public opinion is turning against the Poles, and the Poles are seen as an irritant, as causing difficulties between the great powers. And he's expressing that. Lowe is expressing that with this cartoon, which is really rather cruel. But as you can see, it is indicative of that shifting public opinion towards the Poles. And there's no doubt about the suffering of those in Warsaw, but this is pointing to the leadership of the Warsaw Rising, ultimately in London, and saying, is this really helpful for the success of the Grand Alliance in trying to defeat Hitler? So it's really instructive in sort of highlighting that shift in Western opinion towards the Poles.
And before we finish, I'm going to leave you with a letter from Peter Stulten, a German soldier who fought on the Eastern Front and then in Normandy and then in Poland, in Warsaw. So his letters were given by his sister, and we've gotten hold of some of these letters, and this one is from this day on the 7th of September 1944. He also dies on January the 24th in 1945 on the Eastern Front in Olsztyn. So these are the last surviving records, and it gives us an idea of what life was like for a German soldier during the Warsaw Uprising. So let's have a listen to his letter.
They've bandaged my other eye now. I have shrapnel wounds on the left side of my head, but only shallow ones. Everything's returning to normal. The previous wound has healed now. There was a strange repetition which everyone considers a bad omen. Our own soldiers were killed. First time 6 of them, second time 2, and a few wounded by our own weapons. The enemy fired at us, detonating 1,000 kilos of explosives just 3 meters from my vehicle. I don't consider myself at fault, but it makes no difference. If you bring bad luck, you will be stigmatized, as if you really were guilty. It's a curse. You can see it in everyone's faces. After the explosion, I was lying for hours blinded among the groaning wounded. Now I'm safe and calm. I believe that ill fortune and responsibility educate a man.
And that is the end of day 38 for the Warsaw Uprising. Join us tomorrow for day 39. Hopefully I still have these numbers right, and Zane is not going to yell at me for getting them wrong. So I'm kind of sticking to this of what I've got above me. So we're on day 38. We'll see you tomorrow for day 39. Don't forget, if you do like us, rate us on your favourite listening platform, and do send us to your friends. We're still missing more American listeners. I mean, 51% of our listeners are British. That's not a bad thing. Love the Brits, obviously. British accent here, so clearly got to love the Brits. Yeah, we need some more Americans, and we're building our Canadian listenership too, so some Canadians would be nice. And we haven't got many South Africans or Australians, so if you got any friends in South Africa or Australia, send them our way. Anyway, thank you so much guys, and we'll see you tomorrow.